Have you ever seen a horse with a belly so big it seemed impossible? What could possibly be going on? The answer will leave you speechless. Did you know that problems like this can seriously affect a horse's health and even surprise the most experienced owners? Today, we're going to uncover what made this horse's belly grow so alarmingly and what the owner discovered that changed everything. In this video, you'll learn the warning signs that could save your horse's life, the surprising reason behind this situation, the solutions experts recommend for cases like this. If you love animals and want to ensure their well-being, stick with us until the end, because this could make all the difference. Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on valuable tips like this one. And drop a comment below letting us know where you're watching from. Let's dive in, because this horse's story is going to shock you. The morning sun cast a golden hue over the rolling hills of Joachim's farm, its warmth blending with the soft chirping of birds and the occasional bleating of sheep. Life here was serene, almost timeless. Joachim and his wife, Margarita, had built this sanctuary over decades, turning a patch of barren land into a thriving home for their small flock and beloved animals. Their routine was simple, their joy in the little things profound. Among the animals, Ringo stood out. A towering stallion with a deep brown coat that gleamed in the sunlight, his presence was as commanding as it was comforting. Ringo wasn't just an animal to Joachim, he was a friend, a confidant, and an irreplaceable part of the farm's heartbeat. Joachim often found solace in Ringo's calm demeanor. Whenever the day's work grew exhausting, he'd lean against the stallion's flank, murmuring stories or humming a tune. Ringo would flick his ears and nuzzle him in response, as if to say he understood every word. This morning was like any other, or so it seemed. Joachim fed the sheep, checked on the chickens, and then approached Ringo's stable with a handful of fresh hay. But as he opened the stall door, his eyes fell on something unusual. Ringo's belly looked swollen, the taut skin stretching unnaturally. Joachim furrowed his brow, his instincts tingling with unease. "Ringo, what's going on with you, boy?" he muttered, running a calloused hand over the horse's flank. Ringo let out a soft whinny, but there was no pain in his eyes, only a curious calm. That night, Joachim mentioned the oddity to Margarita over dinner. She dismissed it as a possible overindulgence in feed. But as the days turned into weeks, the swelling didn't recede, it grew. As if that wasn't enough to stir the couple's concern, another troubling pattern began. A lamb went missing one night. Then another. A chicken vanished, leaving no feathers or traces behind. Joachim combed the farm's perimeter for any signs of predators or intruders, but there was nothing. No paw prints, no claw marks, just silence. "I'm telling you, Margarita, it's not normal," Joachim insisted one evening, pacing the kitchen floor. "Something's happening out there, and I can't figure out what." "You're overthinking it," she replied, though her own furrowed brow betrayed her unease. "We'll figure it out. Maybe call someone to take a look at Ringo, at least." Joachim nodded, though he didn't feel reassured. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the weight of the unknown pressed heavily on him. He resolved to keep watch. With a lantern in hand, he stationed himself near Ringo's stable under the cover of darkness. Hours passed, the farm blanketed in stillness. But just as he was about to nod off, a faint rustling caught his attention. He stiffened, heart pounding. The sound wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from within the barn. Joachim tightened his grip on the lantern, the flickering flame casting dancing shadows against the barn walls. He stepped cautiously toward the sound, his boots crunching softly on the straw-strewn floor. The air inside the barn felt different that night, heavier, almost alive. As he approached Ringo's stall, the sound grew louder. It was a strange, muffled shuffling, like something, or someone, moving deliberately. Joachim's heart raced as he pushed open the stall door, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, Ringo stood still, his massive frame illuminated by the faint glow of the lantern. His swollen belly seemed even larger in the dim light, but the stallion's calm gaze betrayed no sign of discomfort. Joachim scanned the area, his sharp eyes searching for anything out of place. That's when he noticed it, a peculiar, shallow groove in the straw near Ringo's feet. "What's this?" he murmured, crouching down to examine the marking. It looked as though something had been dragged across the floor, leading toward the back of the stall. Joachim followed the groove to the corner, where a loose wooden plank caught his attention. Using his pocket knife, he pried the plank loose. A chill ran down his spine as he peered into the dark void beneath the barn. It was a small, hidden space, barely large enough for a person to crawl through. The faint scent of damp earth and something metallic wafted up. Suddenly, a faint scurrying noise echoed from the hole, and Joachim jerked back, nearly dropping the lantern. "Margarita needs to see this," he muttered, his voice shaking. He replaced the plank and hurried back to the house, his mind racing with questions. The next morning, Joachim shared his discovery with Margarita. Together, they uncovered the space beneath the barn. Margarita gasped when they pulled back the plank, revealing a small, dark tunnel that extended into the ground. "This isn't natural," she said, her voice trembling. "Someone made this. But why? And how does it connect to Ringo's condition or the missing animals?" Joachim asked, his frustration mounting. Margarita suggested they call the local vet again, as well as the town's sheriff. "If someone's been sneaking onto our property, we need to know who and why," she said firmly. By midday, the vet, Dr. Wallace, arrived. A tall man with salt and pepper hair and an air of quiet confidence, he examined Ringo thoroughly, his brows knitting together as he studied the horse's swollen belly. "This isn't like anything I've seen," Dr. Wallace admitted after a long pause. "It's not colic or bloat. There's no sign of pain, and his vitals are normal. I'd suggest an ultrasound, but something about this feels off." Joachim and Margarita exchanged uneasy glances. Later that afternoon, Sheriff Harlan pulled up in his dusty patrol truck. A grizzled man with years of experience etched into his face, he listened carefully as Joachim recounted the events. "I'll take a look at that tunnel," Harlan said, grabbing a flashlight. "But if it's as you say, this might be more than just missing livestock." As the sheriff descended into the tunnel, Joachim and Margarita waited anxiously above ground. Minutes passed, then an hour. When Harlan finally emerged, his face was pale, his expression grim. "What is it?" Joachim asked, his voice taut with tension. "There's something buried down there," Harlan replied. "Bones. And not just animal bones. There are human remains too." Joachim staggered back, his mind reeling at the sheriff's revelation. Human remains. How could such a thing exist on his peaceful farm? Margarita clutched her husband's arm, her face pale as she processed the news. Sheriff Harlan wiped his brow and exhaled deeply. "This changes things. I'll have to bring in the state authorities to excavate and investigate. Until then, you both need to stay away from that tunnel." "But what does it mean?" Joachim asked, his voice shaky. "How could there be bones under our barn?" Harlan shook his head. "I don't know yet. But I'll tell you this much, it didn't happen recently. Those remains have been there for a long time." With that, the sheriff left, promising to return with a team the following day. Joachim and Margarita sat in their kitchen, the weight of the discovery pressing heavily on them. "We've lived here for decades," Margarita said softly. "How could we not have known?" Joachim rubbed his temples, his thoughts muddled. "I don't know, but this farm belonged to someone else before us. Maybe there are things about this place we were never told." That night, sleep eluded them both. Joachim sat by the window, staring out at the barn. The usual comfort he found in the familiar silhouette was replaced by unease. He thought about Ringo, about the tunnel, about the missing animals. None of it added up, but the pieces felt connected somehow. As the hours crept by, he decided to return to the barn, his curiosity outweighing his fear. He grabbed his lantern and rifle and headed out, the cool night air sharp against his skin. Inside the barn, everything was still. Ringo stood quietly in his stall, his eyes following Joachim as he approached. Joachim hesitated, then reached out to place a hand on the horse's flank. "Whatever's going on, boy," he whispered, "we'll figure it out." Just then, a faint sound drifted through the barn, a low, rhythmic hum, almost imperceptible. Joachim froze, his ears straining to catch the source. The sound seemed to emanate from beneath the floorboards, faint yet persistent. He moved toward the plank that covered the tunnel and crouched down, pressing his ear to the wood. The hum grew louder, sending a shiver down his spine. It wasn't mechanical or natural, it sounded alive. Suddenly, Ringo let out a sharp neigh, his hooves pawing at the ground. Joachim shot up, his heart racing. The hum stopped abruptly, leaving the barn eerily silent. "I'm losing my mind," Joachim muttered, backing away from the tunnel. He returned to the house, his thoughts swirling with fear and doubt. The next day, a team of state investigators arrived, led by a stern-faced forensic anthropologist named Dr. Evelyn Marks. She introduced herself briskly and got to work, her team carefully excavating the tunnel while Joachim, Margarita, and Sheriff Harlan watched from a distance. Hours passed as bones and artifacts were unearthed. Dr. Marks finally emerged from the tunnel, her expression unreadable. "What did you find?" Harlan asked. "These remains date back at least 50 years, she began. "But what's strange are the carvings." "Carvings?" Joachim echoed. Dr. Marks nodded. "We found fragments of wood and stone with symbols etched into them. They're not consistent with any known cultural practices in this region. It's almost as if someone was performing rituals here." "Rituals?" The word hung in the air like a dark cloud. Joachim felt a cold dread settle over him. What kind of rituals? And why on his land? That evening, Margarita voiced what had been lingering in Joachim's mind. "This isn't just about the bones," she said. "Whatever was happening here, whatever those rituals were, they're tied to what's happening now. To Ringo, to the missing animals. It's all connected." As night fell, the farm seemed to hold its breath. And Joachim, though exhausted, knew he couldn't rest. Something more than history was stirring beneath his feet, something alive, and something waiting to be uncovered. The following morning, Joachim awoke to find the investigators still working near the barn. The hum from the previous night lingered in his mind, gnawing at his nerves. He stepped outside, shielding his eyes from the sun, and made his way to Dr. Marks, who stood over a table covered in artifacts and fragments unearthed from the tunnel. "Morning," Joachim greeted her, his voice hoarse. "Anything new?" Dr. Marks glanced up, her expression a mix of curiosity and unease. "We found more symbols, along with an object buried deeper in the tunnel. It looks like an old chest, sealed shut." "A chest?" Margarita, who had joined them, gasped. "What's inside it?" "We're not sure yet," Dr. Marks replied. "It's fragile. We'll need to handle it carefully to avoid damaging what's inside." The chest was brought to a makeshift station, its wood darkened with age and etched with the same strange symbols. As the team delicately pried it open, Joachim and Margarita stood at a distance, their hands clasped tightly. When the lid finally gave way, a gasp rippled through the group. Inside were weathered scraps of parchment covered in indecipherable script, along with several small, intricately carved figurines. Each figure had an unsettling appearance, distorted, almost human but not quite. "These aren't just artifacts," Dr. Marks murmured, her gloved hands carefully lifting one of the figurines. "They're something else. Maybe offerings." "To what?" Margarita asked, her voice barely a whisper. Before Dr. Marks could respond, one of her team members, a young man named Alex, stumbled back from the chest, his face pale. "I don't think we should be messing with this stuff," he muttered. "Alex, calm down," Dr. Marks said firmly. "No, you don't get it," he snapped. "I've seen these symbols before. My grandmother used to tell stories about them, about people who practiced dark rituals to summon things they couldn't control." The group fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them. "Summon what?" Joaquin finally asked, his throat dry. Alex hesitated, then replied, "Spirits. Beings from somewhere else. She called them the Watchers." Joaquin's stomach churned. He thought of Ringo's swollen belly, of the hum beneath the barn, of the missing animals. Could there be truth to such tales? Later that night, after the investigators had left the farm for the evening, Joaquin sat on the porch, staring into the darkness. Margarita joined him, her face drawn with worry. "What are we going to do, Joaquin?" she asked. "This is bigger than us." "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'm not leaving this farm. Whatever this is, it's happening on our land, and I'm going to get to the bottom of it." As the night deepened, the hum returned, louder this time, resonating through the ground. Joaquin grabbed his lantern and headed to the barn once more, determined to confront whatever lay beneath. When he opened the barn door, he froze. Ringo was no longer standing calmly in his stall. The horse was thrashing wildly, his eyes wide with fear. Joaquin rushed to his side, trying to calm him, but Ringo reared up, letting out a deafening neigh. Then, without warning, the floor beneath Ringo began to crack. Joaquin watched in horror as the ground split open, revealing a chasm filled with an eerie, pulsating light. From the depths of the chasm came a sound, a deep, guttural growl that reverberated through Joaquin's very bones. He staggered back, clutching the stall door for support as Ringo stood frozen, his swollen belly glowing faintly in the unnatural light. The barn filled with an oppressive energy, and Joaquin felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Whatever lay beneath the surface was no longer content to stay hidden. Joaquin stood paralyzed, staring at the chasm that had opened beneath Ringo. The glowing light pulsed like a heartbeat, illuminating the barn in a sinister glow. Ringo remained motionless, his swollen belly trembling as if something inside him was responding to the energy below. "Joaquin!" Margarita's voice shattered the eerie silence as she ran into the barn, clutching a flashlight. Her face turned pale as she took in the sight. What is this?" "I don't know," Joaquin replied, his voice trembling. "But it's coming from down there." The guttural growl rose again, this time accompanied by a faint whispering sound. It wasn't in any language Joaquin recognized, but it felt ancient and malevolent. The whispers seemed to wrap around his thoughts, pulling him into a haze. He shook his head violently, trying to resist. "We have to get Ringo out of here," Margarita shouted, pulling at his arm. Joaquin nodded, snapping out of his daze. Together, they coaxed the terrified stallion away from the chasm, the glowing light dimming slightly as they moved. Once Ringo was outside the barn, Margarita grabbed Joaquin's hand. "We need help," she said urgently. "This isn't something we can handle alone." Joaquin hesitated. Part of him wanted to stay and confront whatever lay beneath his land, but the rational part of him knew Margarita was right. "I'll call Sheriff Harlan," he said. Back at the house, Joaquin placed the call while Margarita kept watch over Ringo. The sheriff answered groggily but immediately perked up when Joaquin described what had happened. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Harlan said, his voice grim. "And I'll bring backup." While they waited, Margarita noticed something strange about Ringo. The horse's swollen belly was shrinking, the taut skin gradually relaxing. But instead of relief, Margarita felt a deep unease. "Joachim," she called, her voice shaking. "Something's happening to him." Joachim rushed outside just in time to see Ringo collapse to the ground, his breathing shallow. Panic gripped him as he knelt beside the horse, stroking his mane. "Stay with me, boy," he murmured, his voice breaking. Before he could do anything else, the ground beneath Ringo trembled violently. A crack snaked its way toward the house, and Joachim and Margarita stumbled backward as another chasm opened, this one smaller but just as menacing. From the new opening, a black mist began to rise, twisting and writhing like a living thing. It moved toward Ringo, wrapping around him in a suffocating embrace. Joachim tried to intervene, but the mist was impenetrable, repelling him with an invisible force. Then, in a blinding flash of light, the mist vanished, and Ringo lay still. Joachim and Margarita stared in shock as the stallion slowly rose to his feet, his movements deliberate and unnatural. His eyes, once warm and familiar, now glowed faintly with an eerie blue light. "Joachim," Margarita whispered, clutching his arm. "That's not Ringo anymore." Before Joachim could respond, Sheriff Harlan's truck roared into the driveway, followed by 2 other vehicles. The sheriff and his deputies jumped out, their weapons drawn. "What the hell is going on here?" Harlan demanded, taking in the sight of the chasm and the unnaturally calm horse. Joachim tried to explain, but the words caught in his throat. As he struggled to make sense of what was happening, Ringo turned his glowing eyes toward the group. The stallion let out a sound unlike anything Joachim had ever heard, a low, resonant cry that seemed to echo from deep within the earth. The chasm began to tremble again, the pulsing light growing brighter. "We need to get out of here," Harlan shouted, motioning for everyone to retreat. But before they could move, something began to rise from the chasm. A massive, shadowy figure emerged, its form indistinct but menacing. The whispers returned, louder this time, as the figure loomed over them. Joachim stood rooted to the spot, his mind screaming at him to run, but his body refusing to obey. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the shadow. Somewhere deep inside, he knew that whatever this was, it had been waiting for this moment, waiting for centuries. The towering shadowy figure seemed to breathe, its presence filling the air with an oppressive weight. Sheriff Harlan and his deputies backed away, their weapons trembling in their hands. Margarita clung to Joachim, her nails digging into his arm. The entity hovered above the chasm, its form shifting and writhing like smoke caught in an invisible wind. Its glowing, amorphous eyes locked onto Joachim, and he felt a jolt of recognition, as if the being knew him. "Joachim," the voice wasn't spoken aloud but seemed to echo directly in his mind, deep and resonant. "You are the keeper of this land. You have disturbed my rest." What are you?" Joachim stammered, his voice barely audible. "I am the Watcher," the entity replied. "Bound to this place by those who came before you. The ones who sought power they could not control." Dr. Marks arrived on the scene moments later, her face pale as she took in the impossible sight. "This can't be real," she whispered, clutching a flashlight in one hand and a notebook in the other. The Watcher's attention shifted to her, its gaze sharp and piercing. "The secrets of this land were never meant to be uncovered," it said. "You bring destruction upon yourselves by prying into the past." Ringo, now eerily still, turned to stand beside the shadow. His glowing blue eyes seemed to radiate a shared purpose with the entity. Joachim's heart broke at the sight of his beloved horse transformed into something unrecognizable. "This isn't right," Margarita cried, stepping forward despite her trembling. "We didn't ask for this. We didn't summon you. You inherited this," the Watcher replied. "The blood of those who invoke me stains the soil, and their debt remains unpaid. What debt? Joachim demanded, his fear giving way to anger. We've done nothing but care for this land. We've worked it, nurtured it, honored it. The Watcher's eyes flared. The land remembers what you do not. The rituals, the sacrifices, they bound me here. And now the bindings weaken. The time has come to choose, repay the debt, or let your world crumble. The ground trembled violently, cracks spreading outward from the chasm. The barn groaned under the strain, and the sheep bleated in terror from their pens. What do you mean by repay the debt? Joachim asked, desperation in his voice. The entity seemed to grow larger, its form filling the night sky. A life for a life. A keeper for a keeper. Joachim felt Margarita's hand tighten on his arm. No, she whispered, shaking her head. There has to be another way. Choose, the Watcher commanded, its voice shaking the earth. Before Joachim could respond, Sheriff Harlan stepped forward, his revolver raised. I don't care what you are, he growled. You're not taking anyone. He fired a shot, the sound echoing like a thunderclap. The bullet passed through the entity harmlessly, the Watcher's form rippling like water. It turned its glowing gaze on Harlan, and the sheriff froze in place, his weapon falling from his hand. A moment later, he crumpled to the ground, unconscious. We don't have much time. Dr. Marks shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. She held up one of the carved figurines from the chest. These symbols, they're meant to seal the entity. We can trap it again if we act fast. What do we do? Joachim asked, his voice frantic. Bring the artifacts to the chasm, Dr. Marks instructed. We'll recreate the ritual and restore the bindings. Margarita ran to the excavation site, gathering the carved figures and scraps of parchment. Joachim helped her carry them to the chasm, where Dr. Marks arranged them in a precise pattern. As they worked, the Watcher grew more agitated, its form thrashing against an invisible barrier. You cannot bind me again, it roared, the sound deafening. We have no choice. Joachim shouted back, his hands trembling as he placed the final figurine in position. Dr. Marks began to chant, reading the ancient script from the parchment. The words felt heavy in the air, charged with an energy that sent chills down Joachim's spine. The light from the chasm grew brighter, and the Watcher let out a deafening roar. Ringo, still standing beside the entity, suddenly collapsed, his glowing eyes dimming. Joachim's heart sank, but he forced himself to focus on the ritual. As the chant reached its crescendo, the glowing light from the chasm erupted in a brilliant flash. The Watcher let out a final, bone-chilling cry before its form was pulled downward, disappearing into the earth. The ground sealed itself, the cracks vanishing as if they had never existed. The barn fell silent, the oppressive energy lifting like a dissipating storm. Joachim collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving as he tried to process what had just happened. Margarita knelt beside him, her arms wrapped around his shoulders. Is it over? She whispered. Dr. Marks, pale and trembling, nodded. For now. But the bindings will only hold as long as the land is respected. Joachim looked toward Ringo's still form, tears streaming down his face. What about him? Dr. Marks shook her head. I'm sorry, Joachim. Whatever connection he had to the Watcher is gone. He's at peace now. The farm was quiet once more, but Joachim knew things would never be the same. The land held its secrets, and though the Watcher was gone, the memory of its presence would linger forever. Chapter 7. After the storm, the first rays of dawn broke over the farm, bathing the land in a golden light that felt almost out of place after the night's terror. Joachim and Margarita sat silently on the porch, their hands intertwined. The barn stood intact, but the memory of the Watcher and the glowing chasm lingered like an ache that refused to fade. The investigators had packed up and left, shaken by the night's events. Sheriff Harlan, still recovering from his collapse, had muttered a curt promise to file something, but left quickly, clearly unnerved by what he'd witnessed. Dr. Marks had stayed behind, sitting in the kitchen with a mug of coffee, flipping through her notes. "You'll need to be careful with the land now," she said quietly, breaking the silence. "Whatever ritual was performed here decades ago, it wasn't meant to be undone. The bindings are fragile, and if they weaken again," she didn't need to finish her sentence. "What do we do?" Margarita asked. "How do we make sure this doesn't happen again?" Dr. Marks looked thoughtful. "Respect the land. Keep it in balance. And if anything seems unusual, call someone who knows what they're dealing with. Don't wait." Joaquin nodded, though the weight of her words pressed heavily on him. The land had been his life's work, his sanctuary. To think it harbored such a dark history was almost too much to bear. The air was heavy with sorrow as Joaquin dug the grave for Ringo beneath the old oak tree at the edge of the pasture. The tree's wide branches stretched over the spot, offering a natural canopy of shade, as if it, too, were mourning the loss. Ringo had always loved this place. Joaquin could still picture the stallion standing beneath the tree on hot summer afternoons, flicking his tail lazily and watching over the other animals. It felt fitting that this should be his final resting place. Joaquin worked in silence, the repetitive motion of the shovel striking the earth offering a strange kind of comfort. Margarita stood a few paces away, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers she had gathered from the creek. Her eyes, red and puffy from crying, were fixed on her husband. She wanted to say something, to offer words of comfort, but nothing seemed adequate. When the grave was finally ready, Joaquin gently lowered Ringo's body into the earth, his movements slow and deliberate. The stallion looked peaceful, his once glowing, unnatural eyes now closed as if in eternal sleep. Joaquin paused for a moment, his hands resting on the edge of the shovel, and let out a deep, shaky breath. "He was more than a horse," Joaquin said, his voice breaking the stillness. "He was family." Margarita stepped forward, placing the bouquet on Ringo's body before Joaquin began to cover him with soil. Each shovelful felt like an act of finality, a painful reminder that life, no matter how cherished, must come to an end. As the last bit of dirt was smoothed over, Joaquin planted a small wooden cross at the head of the grave, etched with Ringo's name. The two of them stood there in silence for a long time, the wind rustling through the oak's leaves. Margarita reached out and took Joaquin's hand. "He's at peace now," she said softly. "He would want us to be, too." Joaquin nodded, though the weight in his chest didn't lift. He felt like he had failed his friend, not just in losing him, but in letting him become part of something dark and unnatural. He glanced at the barn in the distance, its shadow stretching across the field as the sun dipped lower in the sky. "Do you think it's really over?" he asked. Margarita hesitated before answering. "I want to believe it is," she said. "But we can't ignore what happened here. We'll have to watch the land closely, be more careful." The next few weeks were consumed with the routine of repairs and rebuilding. The barn, which had withstood the strange forces unleashed by the Watcher, needed reinforcing. Joaquin spent his days hammering nails, replacing warped boards, and reinforcing the foundation. It was hard, grueling work, but he welcomed the distraction. It kept his mind off the whispers he thought he could still hear at night. Margarita focused on the animals, ensuring they were fed and cared for, but she noticed that they remained skittish. The sheep huddled together nervously, bleating at the slightest sound. The chickens refused to roost in their usual spots, and even the farm dogs seemed reluctant to enter the barn. One morning, as Margarita fed the chickens, she noticed something odd. Near the barn's foundation, a patch of grass had turned black, as if scorched. She knelt to examine it, running her fingers over the brittle blades. There was no smell of fire, no sign of heat damage. It was as if the life had simply been drained from the ground. "Margarita, what is it?" Joachim asked, approaching with a pitchfork slung over his shoulder. She showed him the spot, and his face darkened. "I've seen this before," he muttered. "Years ago, before we even planted crops here. I thought it was just bad soil back then." "What does it mean?" Margarita asked, her voice tinged with fear. Joachim didn't have an answer. Instead, he covered the patch with fresh soil and resolved to keep an eye on it. At night, Joachim found himself drawn to the window overlooking the barn. He would sit there for hours, staring at the shadowy structure, half expecting to see movement. Sometimes, he thought he caught a flicker of light or a faint rustling sound, but when he went to investigate, the barn was always empty. Margarita tried to convince him to get more rest, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered on the farm, something he couldn't see but knew was there. He began to dream of Ringo, of the Watcher, of the chasm that had nearly swallowed them all. In his dreams, the whispers were louder, clearer, repeating a phrase he couldn't understand but felt was important. One night, he woke with a start, drenched in sweat. Margarita stirred beside him, murmuring sleepily. Joachim sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. He knew the healing process wasn't just about repairing the farm or moving past the grief of losing Ringo. It was about understanding the land, respecting it, and finding a way to coexist with its secrets. But deep down, he wondered if the land would ever truly let them forget. As the months passed, life on the farm began to return to a semblance of normalcy. Joachim and Margarita found joy in small victories: a healthy lamb born in the spring, the first bloom of wildflowers by the creek, the sweet scent of hay freshly baled. But the land itself seemed changed. There were days when the air felt heavier, when the wind carried faint, almost imperceptible whispers. Joachim tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just the wind, but deep down, he knew better. One afternoon, as he worked near the barn, he uncovered an old, rusted horseshoe buried in the dirt. It looked ancient, its edges worn smooth by time. As he held it in his hands, he felt a strange sense of connection, a fleeting but undeniable presence. He brought the horseshoe to Margarita, who examined it thoughtfully. "Maybe it belonged to one of the horses before Ringo," she said. "Maybe," Joachim replied, though the weight of the artifact in his hand felt heavier than its physical form. Years passed, and the farm flourished once more. New animals came to replace those lost, and the land yielded bountiful harvests. Joachim and Margarita grew older, their bond deepened by the trials they had faced together. But the whispers never truly stopped. Late at night, when the world was quiet, Joachim would sit by the window and listen. They were faint, like the rustle of leaves or the murmur of a distant stream, but they were there. He came to understand that the land would always carry its scars, just as he carried his. The Watcher had been sealed, but its presence lingered, a reminder of the fragile balance between the past and the present. One autumn evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, Joachim stood at the edge of the pasture, gazing out over the land he had called home for so many years. He felt a strange sense of peace, despite everything. "This is our place," he said softly, more to himself than to Margarita, who stood beside him. "We've made it ours, scars and all." And though the wind carried a faint whisper in response, Joachim chose not to listen.